Since the start of the COVID pandemic, an absolute tsunami of anti-vaccine misinformation has swept the internet, and Joe Rogan was definitely swept away by it. Even though Joe Rogan has had both reasonable scientists and people who have no idea what they're talking about on his show, he seems to have been completely enamored with the ones who have no idea what they're talking about, including people like Robert Malone and Brett Weinstein, whose conversations with Rogan I've previously debunked on this channel. But now we've reached a new level with Joe Rogan platforming the biggest anti-vaxxer in the past few decades, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another debunking video. Obviously, here I'm going to be going through Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s discussion with Joe Rogan, covering the relevant anti-vaccine or COVID claims that he made during that conversation, and explaining exactly why they are just wrong. I'll be doing that with peer-reviewed scientific literature and publicly available data, all of which I'm linking in the description below so that you can read them for yourself and not just take my word for it. You will find that all of the anti-vaccine claims that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. makes in his conversation with Rogan have been tirelessly debunked over and over again for many years. But as misinformation recycles itself, scientists and scientific communicators do have a responsibility to address it each time. So that's what I'm going to do here. And with all that said, let's get started. Let's start at the beginning of this episode with Robert's claims about mercury.
And they kept saying to me, well, I can't answer that detailed question. You need to talk to Paul Offit.
So here he's talking about Dr. Paul Offit, a very well-respected doctor who is responsible for creating the current rotavirus vaccine, a vaccine that is responsible for saving hundreds of thousands of children's lives. I talked to Paul and asked him if he remembers his conversation with Kennedy. He says he does. So I'll be using that as we talk about what Kennedy said about that conversation.
And when I talked to him, I caught him in a lie.
What was the lie?
Well, I asked him this question. I said, why is it that CDC and every state regulator recommends that pregnant women do not eat tuna fish to avoid the mercury, but that CDC is recommending mercury-containing flu shots with huge bolus doses of mercury, massive doses, to pregnant women in every trimester of pregnancy. And he said, well, Bobby, there's two kinds of mercury. There's a good mercury and there's a bad mercury. That his argument was not with me, but it was with the periodic tables, because there's no such thing as a good mercury.
When I talked to Paul Offit about this, he told me that he explained the science to Kennedy, and it's not a lie. Kennedy just doesn't understand basic chemistry. Mercury as an element is not the same in every single chemical context. What do I mean by this? Well, take the element chlorine, for example. If you were to drink elemental chlorine, your stomach would convert it to hydrochloric acid, and it would eat your stomach from the inside out, and you would die. Why then is it okay to eat table salt, sodium chloride? Chemical context. Chlorine's properties are completely different depending on the chemical context. It's the same with mercury. In nature, the mercury that we find naturally in the crust of the earth and in fish is methylmercury. Methylmercury has very different properties than the mercury compound that is associated with vaccines, which is ethylmercury. Methylmercury is able to pass through the cell's membrane, and it is harder to metabolize, giving it a much longer half-life, meaning that methylmercury can accumulate in your body much more easily and cause damage. Ethylmercury doesn't have that problem. Not only can it not pass the cell membrane, but it has a much shorter half-life. Those are just the basic chemical differences that Kennedy completely misses in pretty much every single one of his interviews about mercury and vaccines. But if this is all you know about ethylmercury versus methylmercury, it's completely reasonable to ask, is ethylmercury associated with vaccines safe? But I have a little rule of thumb for you. If you have a scientific question like that, you can pretty much bet that scientists somewhere in the world have asked and tried to answer that question. In this case, scientists all over the world have already asked and answered that question. It's kind of what scientists do. We ask questions and answer them for a living. There have been large population level studies using databases like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, looking at how thimerosal exposure, again, thimerosal is the mercury-containing compound in some vaccines, affects neurophysiological outcomes in children at ages 7 to 10 years. They find that thimerosal-containing vaccines are not associated with deficits in neurophysiological functioning. These findings are repeated in several different studies. These studies have not just been done in the US by the CDC, but all over the world by different groups of researchers belonging to different institutions and universities. Before I move further, it's worth mentioning that thimerosal is no longer an ingredient in childhood vaccines. It was removed as an ingredient in 2001. Thimerosal is only in certain flu vaccines, and you can opt to choose flu vaccines that do not have thimerosal. But Robert claims that they are dangerous specifically for pregnant women. Let's talk about why that's not true. Like I said, ethylmercury is the mercury-containing breakdown product of thimerosal, and included in the many safety studies done on thimerosal over several decades are studies done on the safety of thimerosal-containing vaccines in pregnant women. These studies reaffirm that ethylmercury does not accumulate and does not cause harm to the fetal brain like methylmercury does. We know this because we can measure the clearance of mercury from the body after vaccination, and we see that pretty much all of the mercury that would come from the breakdown of thimerosal after vaccination is excreted harmlessly from the body. So not only is there practically no risk of thimerosal in vaccines to pregnant women, but pregnant women are at increased risk of severe outcomes from infectious diseases like influenza. Vaccination is an incredibly important tool for preventing these kinds of severe outcomes to diseases like influenza in pregnant women, because if they experience those severe outcomes, then they or their unborn baby could possibly die. So Robert's claims here could needlessly scare a pregnant woman into putting herself into a much more dangerous position than is necessary.
Why was thimerosal introduced in the
It was allegedly introduced as a preservative, but it doesn't kill. Streptococcus or any of the other contaminants you would be worried about. In fact, it kills brain cells.
So in that statement, there were lies and completely misleading statements. Thimerosal was never meant to be an adjuvant. There is zero evidence for that in the scientific literature. It was always there to be meant as a preservative. The main purpose of thimerosal in vaccines is to act as something we call a bacteriostatic agent, not necessarily to outright kill bacteria, but to prevent them from growing. You can imagine why it would be important to prevent bacterial growth, why a drug that you inject into your body is sitting on the shelf waiting to be used or being shipped to its final destination. Thimerosal has indeed been tested in experiments we call MIC-MBC, or minimal inhibitory concentration or minimal bactericidal concentrations. And what we see is that thimerosal does indeed work as a preservative. It does also kill human cells. Kennedy is not lying about that part. However, in the concentrations that it is present in the vaccine, it will not be present in those same concentrations once it is injected into your body. Again, just think about this for a minute. You want the concentration of thimerosal or whatever preservative you're using to be a certain amount while it's in the vial so that it can do its job of preventing bacteria from growing. However, when it's injected into your body, that concentration immediately gets diluted to a point where it's not going to have that same biological effect that it did in the vial. So no, it's not going to kill your brain cells. It's just going to keep your vaccine safe.
So at that point, vaccinologists went around searching around the world to find the most horrendously toxic materials to add to vaccines.
No, that's not how vaccine science works. Adjuvants are first and foremost tested for safety. For example, an aluminum phosphate compound called alum, which is a very commonly used adjuvant where adjuvants are used, has been extensively safety tested over several decades. And when it comes to aluminum-based adjuvants, scientists have asked all the questions and answered them. They've tested whether or not it accumulates in your body. It does not. They've tested whether or not it is associated with any adverse neurological outcomes. It is not. And it's been tested whether or not it significantly adds to the exposure of aluminum that you already encounter in your environment every single day, and it does not. His claims about adjuvants are yet another tired, endlessly debunked anti-vaccine claim.
In like 1979, they brought on a vaccine called the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And that vaccine was very dangerous, and it was killing or giving severe brain damage to 1 in 300 kids. And it was pulled in the United States. It was pulled in Europe, but Bill Gates still gives it to 161 million African children every year.
The same vaccine.
Same vaccine. And to South Asian kids.
That's just a lie. Tdap and DTaP are different vaccines. They both give you immunity to diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, but they're slightly different formulations. One is meant for children under the age of 7, and the other is meant for people over the age of 7. Tdap is the one that is for people over the age of 7. It's never been pulled from the market in America. I got mine a few years ago before I had my first child. He's just lying here. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that it was killing or giving brain damage to 1 in 300 children. Another complete lie. The safety profile of these vaccines is extensive. They have been tested in clinical trials. They have gone through a lot of safety testing in several different populations over many, many years. All of it comes to the exact same conclusion that these vaccines are very safe. They work really well against the diseases that they are meant to protect. And there's just no reason to forego them and put yourself at more risk than you would be without them.
And that's the problem with not doing, real placebo-controlled trials. None of the vaccines are ever subjected to true placebo-controlled trials. It's the only medical product that is exempt from that prior to licensure.
This is just a huge lie. Every first vaccine before it goes to market is tested in randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. Kennedy has made this claim so many times, and it is so easy to debunk. The polio vaccine trials back in 1954 were famously randomized, double-blind, and saline placebo-controlled, all the way up to just a few years ago, where COVID vaccine clinical trials were famously randomized, double-blind, and saline placebo-controlled. Joe Rogan's podcast is the most listened to podcast in the world, and he has said repeatedly that he will try to make his show better about spreading misinformation and do better fact-checking. And yet, he has the biggest anti-vaxxer in the world sitting in front of him, and he's making such a huge lie that Joe and Jamie just don't fact-check. What are we doing here?
What they were trying to say is there was this huge decline in mortalities from infectious disease that took place in the 20th century. An 80% drop in deaths from infectious disease. And what caused that? Was it vaccines? And what they said is no, it had very little, almost nothing to do with vaccines.
This is a very common one I hear from anti-vaxxers. It is in fact true that in the 20th century, a lot of improvements to the way we live and take care of ourselves contributed to a decline in mortality. And these changes did not have to do with vaccines. But despite having made big improvements to life expectancy and child mortality, there was still a lot of improvement to be made. We still had huge waves of cases of measles and polio, pertussis, diphtheria. With every single wave of these diseases, not only would children die, but you would have permanent damage. For example, let's just take measles. Before vaccines in America, measles would kill about 400 to 500 kids a year. It would hospitalize about 50,000 kids every year. All of those kids would go to the hospital, get expensive treatment, and suffer. About 1,000 cases of those who survived would result in brain swelling called encephalitis. Many more would develop subsequent ear infections after their measles case and develop permanent deafness. Similarly, death isn't the only bad outcome when it comes to diseases like polio. Do you want thousands of children to be paralyzed every single day? That would be the reality without polio vaccines. The reality is that not only have vaccines saved the lives of millions of people over the past few decades, but it has also driven case rates of diseases down to practically nothing. These are the graphs that anti-vaxxers never show you, and the ones that Robert never addresses.
Because what? Because Reagan caved in, and it wasn't just Reagan, it was the Democrats. My uncle was chairing the health committee at that time, and the Democrats also went along. They passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, and the Vaccine Act gave immunity from liability to all vaccine companies for any injury, for negligence. No matter how negligent you are, no matter how reckless your conduct, no matter how toxic the ingredient, how shoddily tested or manufactured the product, no matter how grievous your injury, your vaccine company, you cannot be sued.
Another huge lie. In America, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program started because many people were believing that their children were being harmed by DTaP vaccines. So many parents believed that their children were being harmed by these vaccines and suing vaccine manufacturers that vaccine manufacturers said, we're not making money off of this. We're just going to stop making these vaccines. So the government actually stepped in and said, no, we need you to keep making these vaccines. So let's figure this out. So the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program essentially was started as a means to have citizens who believe that they were vaccine injured sue and get compensation for their injuries without suing the pharmaceutical companies directly. By the way, those parents who thought their children were being harmed by Tdap vaccines, that was investigated, and it was found that those vaccines had nothing to do with those children's cases of encephalitis. But to get to the meat of Kennedy's claim here, nothing in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program or any relevant law says that vaccine manufacturers are immune from negligence or fraud. They certainly are not. Don't believe me? Well, Kennedy knows that he is lying because he himself has sued Merck multiple times over their HPV vaccine. He is suing vaccine manufacturers because he claims that they are committing fraud and negligence. He's doing what he says isn't allowed. Vaccine manufacturers still have to go through all of the regulations set by the FDA. They are beholden to laws that obligate them to make a drug as safe as possible while following all of the required guidelines to make those drugs as safely as possible. They are required to test their drugs for safety and efficacy. If their drugs don't pass those inspections, their drug doesn't make it to market. And if negligence or fraud involved in that manufacturing or testing slips through the cracks, which is possible, then that manufacturing company can absolutely and will be sued.
And the other thing is they are exempt from pre-licensing safety testing. They don't have to be tested, and they're not. And I said this for many, many years. I said not one of these 72 vaccines has ever been tested pre-licensing in a placebo-controlled trial where you're looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids and looking at health outcomes. Never been done.
Yeah, I already explained why this one's a lie, but let's roll the studies again.
The vaccine schedule immediately after they passed the Vaccine Act exploded because all these companies were rushing to get new vaccines onto the schedule, many of them for diseases that weren't even casually contagious, like ridiculous diseases that are on that, like hepatitis B. Why would you get hepatitis B from sharing needles or from like going to a really seasoned prostitute or from sort of compulsive homosexual behavior.
This is such a bizarre claim that shows that Robert has no knowledge or respect for medicine. Hepatitis B is pretty serious. Infections that turn chronic can result in an increased risk of liver cancer or cirrhosis of your liver. And the younger that you get infected by this virus, the more likely you are to have a chronic infection that leads to these things. And no, it's not just the things that Robert said that can put you at risk of infection with hepatitis B. Hepatitis B can also be transferred because of bites or sanitary habits. And according to the studies that Robert says don't exist, hepatitis B vaccines are extremely safe and they work really well. There's really no downside to taking them, and it offers real protection against a very potentially serious infection early in life. Taking Robert's advice of foregoing hepatitis B vaccination only puts children at greater risk of chronic hepatitis B infections that will increase their risk of liver cancer or cirrhosis.
And then they started seeing all of this explosion in chronic disease, and particularly autism.
Well, here we go. The claim that vaccines cause autism. Robert has been pushing this idea for decades. Remember what I said earlier about if you have a question, scientists have probably already tested and answered that question? Same here. Scientists all over the world have investigated whether or not there is a link between autism and vaccines. They have tested vaccinated versus unvaccinated groups. This includes groups that got a particular vaccine or didn't get a particular vaccine. It also includes groups that received normal childhood vaccinations according to their schedule, and children that received no vaccinations. Some of these studies have followed these children for multiple years, sometimes their whole life, and every single time, the studies find that there is no link between vaccines and autism. None.
Now, 1 in every 34 kids has autism, and half of those are full-blown, meaning that description.
This is the thing I find most disgusting about anti-vaxxers who think that vaccines cause autism. They often describe autism as a fate worse than death, some icky and scary outcome for children that make them suffer their whole life. No, just no. Autism is just a brain type. Autistic people have a lot to offer this world. They are valuable people. Autistic people are not a burden. And Robert, you are honestly despicable for thinking that they are.
Now, what's the conventional explanation for that?
Well, I mean, there's no real explanation.
How do they try to explain?
They try to say, well, we're just noticing it more, which is ridiculous.
Robert can say that's ridiculous, but he's wrong. Pretty much all the experts agree that autism diagnoses have increased because of an increased understanding of the autism spectrum. In fact, when these criteria are applied to older age groups that would have been missed in their diagnosis at younger ages, we find that those autism rates are similar between generations.
And of course, we know why. Because aluminum adjuvants give you allergies. They're designed to make you, to create a hyperimmune response to foreign particles.
Form particles. What's he even talking about? Anytime throughout this interview when he tries to talk about actual molecular mechanisms, he just stumbles all over his words and falls flat. He can't explain anything because he doesn't know anything.
So we are the sickest generation in history. There's no other country in the world that has this kind of chronic disease epidemic.
Robert, just think about that for a minute. You think that vaccines are contributing to this increase in chronic diseases in America. Did you stop to consider that many European countries have better childhood vaccination coverage than we do? And their chronic disease issues are not as bad as the US. Maybe it's not vaccines. Yeah, he definitely didn't think about that one.
Wi-Fi radiation does all kinds of bad things, including causing cancer.
Wi-Fi radiation causes cancer?
From your cell phone. I mean, there's cell phone tumors. I'm representing hundreds of people who have cell phone tumors behind the ear. It's always on the ear that you favor with your cell phone.
Now Robert's saying Wi-Fi causes cancer. Dear Lord, no it doesn't. And the reason is very simple. When it comes to radiation like radio waves, microwaves, X-rays, etc., there are generally two kinds, ionizing and non-ionizing. Putting it simply, ionizing radiation is strong enough to break the bonds within your cell's DNA. That causes DNA damage and increases your risk of cancer. Ionizing radiations that do this are things like X-rays, which is why you wear that giant lead vest every time you get an X-ray at the dentist. Other forms of radiation, like radio waves, which is what Wi-Fi is, are non-ionizing. They are not strong enough to break the bonds in your DNA, they do not cause DNA damage, and they do not increase your risk of cancer. Are there ways other than direct DNA damage that radiation could increase your risk of cancer? Yes, but that radiation would have to be strong enough to penetrate through your skin and into your tissues, and Wi-Fi doesn't do that.
Wi-Fi radiation opens up your blood-brain barrier. And so all these toxins that are in your body can now go into your brain.
How does Wi-Fi radiation open up your blood-brain barrier?
Yeah, now you're going beyond my expertise. But what?
Decent question, Joe. But as you can see, when asked for mechanisms, Robert stumbles over his words and can't give an answer because he doesn't actually know, because he doesn't know anything on this topic. What are we doing?
Even after I got over COVID, I had people that I that I admired. They were telling me you should get vaccinated now. I said, why? Why? This make sense to me. Sanjay Gupta said that to me. I'm like, make it make sense to me.
So next, we're getting into COVID topics, and Joe starts by asking why it makes sense to get vaccinated after he's recovered from COVID. This question was answered pretty early on after vaccines were rolled out. It has to do with something called somatic hypermutation. Upon multiple exposures to an antigen, your immune system will broaden its capability to respond to that antigen. In the case of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, if you get infected and survive it, presumably without any horrible long-lasting effects, then if you get vaccinated on top of that, then your body will further train itself against SARS-CoV-2. What you end up getting is a broadening immunity that will protect you against more variants. This was empirically measured in 2021, where people who had recovered from COVID and then gotten just one dose of COVID vaccine had amazing immunity. This is because your immune system is able to capture antigen, bring it to immune organs called lymph nodes, and within those lymph nodes, there are structures called germinal centers. In those germinal centers, the cells that make antibodies, which are your B cells, are training themselves to make better and better antibodies against that antigen while that germinal center is active. And we know that vaccination is really good at stimulating these long-lasting germinal centers that give you better and better immunity as time goes on. And to be extremely clear here, I'm talking immunity against disease. Immune memory is what we're going for with these vaccines. You want your immune system to be able to remember that it encountered SARS-CoV-2 antigen and be able to recall it whenever it encounters the real thing. That's what these vaccines are really good at doing, and that's why getting vaccinated after you get infected is really important, because it's going to better protect you against not just the circulating variant at the time, but future variants as well. I'm simplifying this as much as possible, but we've got a lot more misinformation to get to, so if you're more interested in this, links are in the description.
And that they concentrated on this one medication that my doctor prescribed for me, which was ivermectin. They didn't concentrate on all the other stuff that I took. They didn't concentrate on the Z-Pack. They didn't concentrate on the prednisone. They didn't concentrate on the monoclonal antibodies or the IV drip of vitamins that I did, and NAD, the NAD plus cocktail. I did a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I did all the same stuff.
Yeah, and I got better quick. And
Yeah, me too.
but no one cared that I got better. That was not the narrative. The narrative is like Joe Rogan is taking veterinary medication.
Joe seems to be really upset about how the media treated him after he got COVID. Look, Joe, I'm glad you got better. I'm happy that you didn't experience the terrible outcomes that millions of others did, including healthy people your age. But you are the host of the most listened to podcast in the world, and you were telling people that you took ivermectin and that it helped you. That's misinformation. It just is. I keep telling you that scientists really like to ask and answer questions. And we asked the question, does ivermectin work against COVID? And the answer was no. It's really been tested every which way. It doesn't help you once you're already in the hospital. It doesn't prevent people from getting into the hospital with COVID. It doesn't work at lower doses, doesn't work at higher doses. It just doesn't work. All of these have been tested. It just doesn't work. And yet Joe Rogan, the host of the most listened to podcast in the world, said that it helped him and would not budge on it despite this evidence. That's why the media had a problem with you, bud. That's why scientists have a problem with you. You cannot say those things and not expect criticism. And Joe did not just take ivermectin. He took a whole cabinet's worth of medicines, including medications that actually had efficacy at the time, like monoclonal antibodies, which, by the way, are super expensive. So Big Pharma thanks you, Joe, for taking all their medicine.
And there's also studies on people that got administered to the ICU with COVID, that somewhere in the those above 70% were deficient in vitamin D.
Yeah, I think it was over 90%.
Yeah, it's to have a conversation with someone who doesn't take vitamins and is telling you have to take this medication. It's like, this is a crazy conversation.
My friend Dr. Ian Copeland has this analogy about vitamin D and COVID, so I'll use it here. If I show up at a fire and I see smoke and ash on the ground, I might think, wow, all this smoke and ash is causing the fire. If I get rid of the smoke and ash, I'll save the house. It's not how it works. Often when you get really sick with something like COVID, your vitamin D levels can drop. That doesn't mean that the low vitamin D levels caused your severe illness. Now, it could be reasonable to ask, what if we restore those vitamin D levels? Does that help? The answer is no. Again, scientists have asked that question and tested it. Treatment of COVID with vitamin D has no effect. It doesn't work as a COVID treatment. So no, Joe, the answer to infectious disease is not just taking vitamins and living a quote-unquote healthy lifestyle, whatever that means. Infectious disease can still take you down. But vaccination is a really good way to reduce the risk of that happening.
There's good evidence that the Spanish flu, there's not a definitive, but very, very strong evidence. The Spanish flu was vaccine-induced flu. The deaths were vaccine-induced.
Oh, wait, you're serious? Let me laugh even harder.
What? Oh, what am I listening to? The Spanish flu was vaccine-induced? What? God. Flu vaccines weren't even around during the 1918 flu. Is he saying that smallpox vaccines caused a flu pandemic? I mean, what? What? This is crazy. I don't know. Robert always has a way of surprising me with how wacky he goes. I did not expect this.
Originally, they said it was a flu, but when they've gone back and actually they have all the samples from thousands of people, they died from bacteriological pneumonia.
This part of the podcast was hard to listen to. It was like put a pillow over my face and scream levels of mind-numbing. In it, you have two grown men, the biggest anti-vaxxer in the world and the most listened to podcaster in the world, failing to understand the basic concept that when influenza, the 1918 influenza specifically, was ripping through the population, it was causing pneumonias as a secondary outcome. It does this by attacking the cells in your lungs and respiratory tract and making them more vulnerable to secondary bacterial infection that would normally be kept in check. But because this virus is wreaking havoc on your body and your immune system is overwhelmed with it, it can't deal with the normal bacteria. Here are two images of a mouse trachea. On the left is a healthy one. On the right is a trachea that was just ravaged by an influenza virus, with a little white blood cell floating along, far too late to help. This is what the literature means when it says that most of the deaths during the 1918 flu were actually caused ultimately by pneumonia. But the pneumonia would not have happened had the virus not come in and wreaked havoc on the body.
Bacteriologic and histopathologic results from published autopsy series clearly and consistently implicated secondary bacterial pneumonia caused by common upper respiratory tract bacteria in most influenza fatalities.
Yeah, and some people have suggested that came from getting people to wear masks.
Oh, Jesus.
Oh my God, it just gets worse. No, Robert, it was the virus that stripped your body's defenses and made it vulnerable to bacterial infection and subsequent pneumonia. That's why 50 to 100 million people died in the 1918 to 1990 flu pandemic. Not because of masks. Jesus Christ.
They had to discredit ivermectin because, because there's a federal law. The federal law, the emergency use authorization statute says that you cannot issue an emergency use authorization to a vaccine if there is an existing medication that has been approved for any purpose that is demonstrated effective against the target illness. So they had to destroy ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and discredit it, and they had to tell everybody it's not effective, because if they had acknowledged that it's effective in anybody, the whole $200 billion vaccine enterprise would have collapsed.
All right, we're coming out of Kooky Town and back into big old lie town. This is another big lie. No, EUAs are issued in an emergency state. And during the COVID pandemic, there was an emergency state. Let's say ivermectin did work against COVID. In that case, it would have received emergency use authorization for use in COVID patients. The same way there was an emergency use authorization for Pfizer's COVID mRNA vaccine, and monoclonal antibodies, and Moderna's mRNA vaccine, and the adenoviral vector-based vaccines, and Paxlovid. You see where I'm going with this? There were multiple EUAs for multiple different drugs issued throughout the pandemic. Some were repurposed drugs, some were new drugs. An EUA for ivermectin against COVID would not have changed subsequent EUAs.
AZT, which was initially a chemotherapy medication that was killing people in a 2-week dose. They were giving them 2 weeks of this stuff was killing people faster than AIDS was killing people.
Yeah.
And they went and took that, faster than cancer was killing people. And they went and took that and started giving them to people that had
too
AIDS.
dangerous for it to treat as a cancer.
Right.
This part of the podcast was one of the most frustrating parts for me to listen to, where they're talking about AZT, otherwise known as zidovudine or retrovir, which is just one antiretroviral medication in a modern antiretroviral cocktail against HIV. This modern cocktail of antiretrovirals turned an HIV diagnosis from a death sentence to a lifelong manageable infection. AZT was a drug that already existed, and it was previously tried as a chemotherapy, a cancer drug, but it didn't work, and there's a reason for that. AZT is a molecule that binds to an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. This is an enzyme necessary for the HIV's life cycle. This enzyme takes RNA and turns it into DNA. Humans don't have this reverse transcriptase, but we do have something called a DNA polymerase. It's an enzyme that reads DNA and makes copies of it. The enzymes are very different, but similar enough that this drug binds to DNA polymerase as well as reverse transcriptase. It just binds to DNA polymerase a lot less well than reverse transcriptase. And this binding a lot less well is why it didn't work as a cancer drug. The idea would be for it to inhibit DNA polymerase so that quickly dividing cells would not survive as well. But it doesn't bind that enzyme super well, so it had to be used in toxically high doses to get any effect. So it didn't work. But with HIV, it binds the reverse transcriptase enzyme a lot better, so it could be used at much lower doses effectively against HIV without getting those toxic side effects associated with high doses. And AZT works until HIV mutates. That's why modern HIV treatments involve a cocktail of antiretrovirals. You see, when there's just one part of the virus being targeted by one molecule, if that part mutates, then the virus is resistant. But if there are multiple drugs targeting multiple parts of the virus, it's a lot harder for one virus to gain enough mutations all at once to resist all of those antiretroviral drugs. With modern antiretroviral cocktails, HIV infections can be kept in check for practically a lifetime. And many of those cocktails still include AZT. AZT was the first step towards an antiretroviral treatment against HIV. But Kennedy, in his book, which Rogan apparently loves, claims that AZT is poison. And he even claims that HIV doesn't cause AIDS in his book. It's absolutely wild. I reviewed the book in full in another video series on my channel. You can go check that out for more details. But I just want to take a moment to tell you how disgusting this is. In Kennedy's book, he mentions a woman named Christine Magyar. In the book, he essentially praises her for her activism as an AZT denier. She denied that AZT was a useful medication against HIV. She thought it was poison. However, Christine herself was HIV positive. So she was denying taking AZT to treat her infection, and she got pregnant, and she had a daughter, and she passed HIV on to her daughter. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and her daughter passes away due to HIV/AIDS complications because she's not allowing her daughter to take what she believes is poison. Not long after her daughter dies, a preventable death, she herself passes away from HIV/AIDS. Robert doesn't tell that story in his book, and doesn't mention it here, of course. But that's the reality of what Robert is pushing. He's pushing a world where preventable deaths happen all the time, where mothers who have been brainwashed by fear are putting children that they love in positions where they are going to die preventable deaths. It's sick, it's twisted, and It is absolutely maddening that those messages are being pushed by the host of the most listened to podcast in the world. It's disgusting, and I hope people see it for what it is. Whew, okay, let's move on to the rest of the video. We're almost done.
But anyway, they gave us the 6 months of data for the 2 designated groups, and it's an alarming result because there were 4 people who died of 4 to 5 people who died of cardiac arrest in the vaccine group, and only 1 in the placebo group. What that means is if you take the vaccine, you're 21% more likely to die over 6 months, according to this data, which is not good data and not enough of a big group, of a large enough group to really make these kind of predictions. But it's all they gave us. So they're stuck with this number.
Okay, so here he's talking about the randomized clinical trials for Pfizer's COVID vaccine, which conveniently was a saline placebo-controlled trial, something he denies ever happens. Cool. But he's complaining about it because he says that there were more cardiac deaths in the vaccine group than the placebo group. He completely fails to mention that this was a non-significant result. It was 4 deaths versus 1 death. The clinical trial was not powered to statistically measure differences in those kinds of outcomes. Its only purpose was to measure whether or not COVID vaccines prevented symptomatic infection. And they did. Not only that, but it's not all we have, as he implies. There are mountains of pharmacovigilance data surrounding Pfizer's vaccine, Moderna's vaccine, and all the other COVID vaccines. This pharmacovigilance data involves several different reporting databases and health agencies all across the world actively investigating the ongoing safety of these vaccines in the population. You can read several of these publications that show the results of these investigations for free, and all of them show that COVID vaccines are extremely safe. What do I mean when I say that they're extremely safe? Do I mean 100% safe, never cause harm, never cause a death? No, I don't mean that, because that's an unrealistic bar for a medication to reach. Every single medical intervention, every single action you do, every single choice you make has risk. Nothing is 100% safe. The question is vaccination safer than not vaccinating? And the answer is that yes, vaccination is much safer than not vaccinating.
But in 1976, when they had this, really bad flu shot that they did the same thing with, they did a, global rollout and everybody had to take it. And they pulled the shot after 25 deaths reported. 25.
I've heard some other conspiracy theorists make this similar claim before, and it's extremely misleading. In 1976, there were no confirmed deaths attributed to that influenza vaccine rollout. What actually happened in 1976 was there was a prediction that the flu strain circulating that year would be really bad. And so there was a large push to vaccinate people before flu season started. It turned out that the flu, for whatever reason, just wasn't that deadly that year. The predictions were wrong. And so the vaccination campaign stopped because it wasn't needed, not because the vaccines weren't safe. That's the real story there. You can read more about it in the description, but Kennedy is not telling it accurately. He's being dishonest.
But also, you need to get rid of these really corrupting financial entanglements between the pharmaceutical industry and the regulatory agencies that has put agency capture on steroids. For example, almost 50% of FDA's budget comes from pharmaceutical companies.
Nope, that's not true. What really happens is whenever a pharmaceutical company submits material to the FDA, whether it's a biological licensure agreement or a new drug application, they have to pay fees. And these fees for their submission come out of pocket. They're quite expensive, actually. And those fees fund the work that the government does in that area. So really, it's one less thing that taxpayers have to fund. In reality, pharma would rather not pay millions of dollars out of pocket just to submit applications to the FDA that are most likely going to fail. I mean, really, that's the reality here. A whopping 80% of new drug applications fail. Not exactly a rubber stamp pipeline, is it? So the question for anyone out there who thinks that there are huge conflicts of interest here, why is that new drug application approval number so low? Wouldn't you expect it to be higher in a world where pharma is just getting anything by because they pay for it?
This is my point that I asked him what does. And he said, there's there's environmental factors they're aware of. I go, what are those? And he couldn't cite them.
Yeah.
Like, how can you be so sure to say this definitely doesn't, but you're telling me there's a bunch of environmental factors that do cause it, and we're aware of those factors, but you're not aware of them and you're an expert in this?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
If Joe took a moment to actually read about what we know about what causes autism, he would find that the real answer is it's complicated. There are known genetic factors that can influence whether or not someone is on the autism spectrum. There are also known environmental factors, such as air pollution, that can influence an autism outcome. The mechanistic link between these factors and autism is not well understood or nailed down. Science is still working on that. People are still asking questions and looking for answers. But we do know enough about autism to know that it most likely starts in utero. In utero, when your nervous system develops, your body prunes the synapses on your neurons. And it is thought that in people who have autism, this pruning doesn't happen as much as other people, which contributes to their sensory overload. But when it comes to things like vaccines, we can directly test whether or not they increase the risk of autism. That testing has been done countless times, and every time there is no link. Just because we don't understand something completely doesn't mean we can rule things out when it comes to what causes it. But if Joe Rogan wants to ignore the wealth of scientific knowledge built around this topic over several generations and plant himself firmly in the vaccines cause autism camp of the early 2000s, right next to Jenny McCarthy and Andrew Wakefield, then he can dig that hole himself.
But the fact that no one will debate you speaks volumes, especially now. They can't say now that you're not popular.
No one is obligated to debate RFK Jr. RFK Jr. knows nothing about science. He knows nothing about vaccines or medicine. These debates have already happened in the scientific literature, at conferences, in lab meetings, at the water cooler in scientific institutions. These debates have happened, the literature is out there, and it's over. Vaccines don't cause autism. Vaccines aren't responsible for chronic conditions. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been pushing these long debunked ideas for decades, and he got a huge lucky break when Joe Rogan was gullible enough to have him on his show and indulge every wacky idea he has. Whether or not a debate between some scientist and RFK Jr. happens on Rogan's podcast, and no matter the outcome, it's not going to change the evidence. Dangling money for scientists to come dance like a puppet for him on his podcast and debate a quack who has absolutely no idea what he is talking about and has been pushing genuinely harmful, science-denying ideas for decades is just such a sad state for the most listened to podcast in the world. Disinformation around vaccines is not going away. It's going to get recycled over and over again. But each time it gets recycled, you can be better prepared. Hopefully, I have helped you do that in this video. Again, all of the links to all of the science that I talk about are in the description below. And with that, I think I'm going to end this video here. Thank you very much for watching if you made it this far. I really do appreciate it. I'm just a regular scientist making these videos in my free time. So if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribed. And you can join me next time, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.